we've already seen some people who've become enmeshed with their chat bots to the point where they declare love and attachment for them. If you're sharing your most intimate thoughts, ideas, photos, videos, whatever, with any AI, you should keep in mind it's still technology, and you have to think about where this data is going. A robot or an AI could potentially nudge you towards like watching conservative news shows or podcasts or something because of the ownership of the system. I'm not telling people not to use them for fun. And I'm trying to do is to communicate the level of what goes on behind the scenes and the goals that corporations or the entities that have developed the AI are not necessarily aligned with your goals.
Dr Julie Carpenter, welcome to Sex and Space. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm excited to be part of this.
Awesome. So you're a social scientist, and which is great because you're bridging the gap between vast quantities of very complicated data and turning it into wonderful data about the human experience, I should say, and turning that into wonderful data for all of us to digest at our leisure and also, help us to with insights and predicting future trends in emerging technology, mitigating the pitfalls that potentially could come up, which is very, very welcome. You have a new book, The Naked Android, Synthetic Socialness and the Human Gaze, which is exploring how people create narratives around AI and robots, their expectations of robotic behaviour, and how cultural beliefs shape real-world design and use. I mean, that's so much to unpack. Let's start right at the beginning. How did you get into this?
That's always such a loaded question because I think I always scare an interviewer that I have to go back and acknowledge a couple of things. As a social scientist, I have to talk about my own situatedness in a timeline here of technology that we're about to talk about. I'm Gen X, right? So I grew up largely 70s, 80s. My father was a huge influence on my interest in technology, my interest in science fiction and things like that. I had access to one of the first home computers, a VIC-20. He liked to teach me things like how to build circuits and things like that. So I was embedded in that, but also in his interest in science fiction. Those were big influences for me. And I started on a school path in art history and film because I was also growing up in an era where things like fields of study of human-computer interaction or human-robot interaction or user research even were just starting. And there were very few schools that offered that kind of research. So my background was actually film theory. So a lot of how I approach things sometimes is as a media scholar or almost as an art historian. Or, I think that shows in the ethnographic methods I use, a lot of interviews and observation and contextualizing people's situations by using little snippets of the media that people are immersed in their particular time period or things that are meaningful to them. But specifically how I got into this, really I fell into it again like a lot of Gen X. I came out of school with this film degree in the middle of Wisconsin in the United States, which is not known for, it's never been frankly known for its film. So it's not the Hollywood of the Midwest, So I'm not quite sure what I anticipated doing with it, but I ended up at my first job out of school. They needed someone to work web work, and I said, I'll do it because I had this background with home computing and I was not afraid to do it. I was the only person at work who raised my hand. And that's how a lot of us Gen X, sort of fell into or got into working with computers.
Yeah, of course.
This was around Y2K. Again, not to scare you, we're going back in time. I'll progress forward quickly here. But people were panicking. We joke about it now, but people had all kinds of concerns about markets crashing, AI taking over, what was going to happen. And it so happened my job at work was not just running the websites, but taking calls from the general public. And that's when I realized the crossover, what I was putting on the web and the authority that it held for people who were reading information on the web. And I was making these connections between user emotions, user belief, the authority of a web voice, like versus my own voice as a person for the organization. It was interesting. And I reached out to Clifford Nass, who's a scholar at Stanford. He was in one of the few human-computer interaction programs at the time. And luckily for me, he was extremely generous with his time with me, this random person who sent him an email, and he actually ended up mentoring me a bit. And Cliff Nass is a scholar who's well known in human-computer interaction. He came up with Byron Reeves the idea of computers being social actors. So he was one of the first scholars to come forward and say, computers are not just acting as tools for us. People are acting as if they're a medium, as if they're an extension of themselves, as if it's, something that has different voices and tones like authority, that's developing things like reliance. People are interacting with it in a social, unanticipated way.
Right.
So that was that. And then I have to say, I often say part of my origin story was seeing the work of David Hansen in Hansen Robotics very early in his career. Showed one of the heads or torso of an early robot model he was working on. You may know Hansen Robotics today does Sophia, which is a highly human-like female robot that's sort of been out in the media a lot. So Hansen Robotics still does very well, but he comes from a Disney background and focuses a lot on the external appearance of robots, making them look lifelike. And when I saw that, at that point, I had been going to school further for human-computer interaction. So my sort of academic mind was piqued with all of these questions about how people were interacting with computers as new technologies. And then when I saw how lifelike robots were beginning to appear, combined with how quickly the technology all of a sudden was rapidly going crazy in robotics around that time, early 2000s. And these things were coming together. And to me, this medium of robotics, humanoid robotics, robots as social actors, social robots, to me, then just became a real point of research interest in how people would interact with them. So that's my very long origin story.
No, it's amazing. And so interesting, like how on one hand you've got, probably what would have been a sort of circa year 2000 big computer monitor, faceless connection to the internet that people are having an emotional connection with or building an emotional connection with. And on the other hand of that, you've got a sort of Disney-influenced humanoid trying to be as real as possible. I mean, those two things couldn't be they seemed like sort of polar opposites of this in this world. Just to touch on how easy we can form emotional attachments with things and why. Can we talk about pets?
So with pets, with animals, right, they do give us all sorts of lifelike cues. We recognize them as organic, as biological, and therefore if we have empathy as humans for another living thing that we regard as sentient, and that's where things get sticky. With animals too, what do we regard as intelligent and not intelligent? There's that fine line of what can we eat and what can't we eat, or how we treat it or how we don't treat it, how the animal acts in relation to us. Is it violent towards us? Are we that animal's natural prey, or are we that animal's natural predator? All of those interactions come into play. And similarly, with robots, that context and personas and our inferences of how we expect the robot to act, all of these very complicated things come into play. With robots as a specific type of technology that's not like a static, non-dynamic technology, like, again, like holding up my phone. My phone, I don't recognize as autonomous from myself. I don't think the phone has an intent in any way. Therefore, I don't impose any sort of special narrative on my phone. I haven't named it. Some people do, and that's not weird. That can be like some people name a car, but you don't necessarily see the car as something separate from yourself. You don't recognize it necessarily as having an autonomy from yourself. So when something gives you design cues like movement or natural language, or think of R2D2, which doesn't speak in a natural language and uses chirps and clicks and whistles, but does so in a context where it's taking turns with the human speaker, where the clicks and whistles you can understand because of the context or how the robot moves or where its attention is turned. All of those things are examples of lifelike cues that make you interact with a robot like R2D2 that looks like a trash can, right, on wheels, but makes you interact with it in a human-like way.
Yeah.
Those are some of those cues. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny that you mention cars and other things. I mean, I guess you could say that power of storytelling that we allow ourselves to do or have others do. Things like emotional attachment to your favorite teddy bear when you're a kid, right? Or maybe it's a car or a motorbike. Because in some way you've narrativized that it defines you in some way or completes a picture of you in some way. Like, I ride a sports motorbike, I ride a cruiser, I ride a dirt bike. Those sorts of things, I imagine as well, if someone came along and ripped that away, there'd be a real sense of grief. Same sort of thing as the teddy bears and etc. and the pets. And then, any robot attachments as well. Can we just define... It's so funny talking about robots and then your phone as well, you mentioned, and stuff like that. What are we talking about when we're talking about, this sort of synthetic social world that we live in? And, we've got these categories, I suppose, of AI and robotics, all this kind of things. I mean, is it anything from a smart alarm clock all the way through to a robotic sex doll to ChatGPT?
Yeah, that's, again, a really good question because we do throw around those terms a lot. So starting with the fact that AI is separate from robotics, can be part of robotics. So if you think of AI is literally artificial intelligence, and it's a computer science field or engineering field that is about creating machines that can learn and reason and act independently of humans, supposedly autonomously or semi-autonomously, and adapt to their environment dynamically. The problem with that definition, or the feature of that definition, is that it's extremely broad. And as you said, that could apply to a lot of things. The classic thing in engineering, they'll say, is what that applies to a thermostat, a wall thermostat, for example. It's So it's a very broad definition of AI, but it's, that's what that is. Robots, and you speak to anybody in robotics, and everyone's going to have their own definition. Sometimes in interviews, they'll throw it back and say, and maybe I will know. I'll say, what do you think a robot is? Because I always find that answer really interesting before I give my own. What's your definition, or what do you think of when you think of a robot?
Yeah, I guess I try and categorize it as broadly as possible. There's obviously the where your brain goes to, your R2D2s and that sort of stuff. And I guess I'd just bring that right back to something as simple as, say, do you remember a Furby? Those funny little fuzzy toys?
Yep.
Something like that, I guess. That would be my, extreme. And in there, you've got our vacuum cleaner is on that spectrum somewhere that bumbles around and does its own thing.
Yeah, and those are great answers. And that is really typical. And again, I'm going to contextualize this for people in my generation, your generation. We haven't interacted a whole lot with robots yet that are very sophisticated. So a lot of our references are based on stories like science fiction. Your brain, when you think of robots, immediately goes to, and it might go to news stories. You might think of an industrial robot, but you
Yeah.
might think of the science fiction ones, or you might think of a toy, an early toy that you've seen that's really not a super sophisticated one, but was marketed as a toy robot, right? Or,
Yeah.
some of the real robots that exist right now, like Sophia, et cetera, that are semi-autonomous, not really autonomous, but you've seen them on TV, but you haven't really interacted with one. And that's going to be a different experience than when your child answers in 10 years and you ask them, what is a robot? And their references are going to be very different. But I just wanted to put that out there because we as lay people often have these expectations of what a robot is. And again, the definition is very blurry right now. It's sort of an embodied intelligence, AI, that I described earlier. So it would be something that has a physicality to it, a physicalness that can interact with its environment in a physical way using that artificial intelligence. So, but that's all over the place. There are industrial robots, right? There are
Yeah.
military robots that don't resemble humans at all right now, that look tank-like or machine-like or like a backpack or, all sorts of things. There are toy robots. There are social robots. There are really all
Yeah.
kinds of robots. Yeah.
Have you seen stories of humans becoming attached or empathetic or any such way with these robots, even from their earliest sort of
Yes.
iterations? Yeah.
Yeah, and so that was very interesting to me when I was in my doctoral program in graduate school, and of course paying attention to all of this because of human robot interaction and this empathy interest in that interaction space that was not being studied in the way that I thought it should be, as deeply as it should be, is an emerging set of issues. And I noticed in popular news stories that in what was emerging in a military robot settings where there were anecdotal stories being reported of people having empathy for military robots that had become injured or disabled in some way and were therefore like pulling themselves across a field or
Yeah.
but still seem to have motion to them, or just that the robot was disabled and unable to work further with that team member or that team, and people would say, oh, I kind of miss that robot, etc.
Yeah.
So I started noticing these patterns, and that led to my personal interest in what led to my first book about how should I put this? Looking at robots in a military setting where these robots don't look human-like at all, okay? So they are robots that are designed to be tools. I was privileged enough to speak with explosive ordnance disposal personnel in the U.S. military. At the time, there were about 5,000 of them total. I spoke to about 23 of them for the actual research in-depth part. And I situated everything within FOIA requests of the government, looking into what U.S. military and other militaries are doing with robots in the near future, et cetera. All of these things fed into this research. But anyway, so first of all, what's interesting about EOD personnel or explosive ordnance disposal personnel, some of the many things interesting about them is that they're highly trained, that they're the only group within the military that's had the opportunity to work with robots as tools for decades because they've needed to, because they can keep soldiers safe at a distance from explosives, from things like improvised explosive devices, from whatever they might be working with that's potentially could go off, any kind of explosive. And the robots they worked with primarily were two models at the time, a PackBot and a Talon. The PackBot literally is shaped like backpack-like. It's meant to be carried that way. It's not very big. It's shaped sort of like a mini tank. It moves around a little bit like a home vacuum cleaner. It's semi-autonomous. Both robots are game controlled. The controllers are actually modeled on game controls, so it's easier for people to learn. The larger model looks similar. You've probably seen them on the news, unfortunately, used by police often to disarm vehicle-borne IEDs. They are about the size of maybe your dining room table. Also, do not look like humans or animals. Again, these soldiers are highly trained, work with these robots every day. They're under no illusions about the limitations or capability of these robots. They know that they're not extremely intelligent. In fact, they're known for sort of being a little unpredictable and hinky and not working super well all the time. But yet I found instances where the soldiers did have attachments to the robots and spoke about it often in pet-like ways, like we were discussing earlier, but sometimes more in its own category, that they would, and I use the word negotiate, that they would negotiate even while they were discussing it with me, sometimes as they were coming to a realization within their talks with me. For example, one soldier said that he realized he spent more time with the robot than he had with his girlfriend over a couple of years because he had been stationed overseas. He slept with the robot next to him in a truck. He took care of the robot every day. He had to clean it and care for it. That was his job. He operated the robot. The robot kept him safe at a distance because it did the work for him. The team had named the robot and agreed on a name for it in a pet-like way. He had, and this is fairly common, or common amongst the group of people I spoke with, there was a pattern emerging of people who operated the robots, perhaps unsurprisingly, but it makes sense, would see the robot as an avatar of themselves. So the robot becomes an extension of their hands, of their arms, at a distance, which makes it interesting because then the robot became a representation of that team member to their other teammates. Let me give you an example. If different teams were running robots with the different operators, team members could recognize which robot was being run by who by the strategies that were being used. So even though the robots might look identical, they could recognize the quote-unquote personalities of the robots by who's operating them. Furthermore, this identification could be so strong that they would often sort of affiliate it as an extension of the operator. So if the operator was named Corporal Johnson, they might name the robot Little Johnny or something that was associated as an extension of that person. Other, naming conventions and story-like sort of adaptations of these robot interactions also fell into the categories of pet-like. Sort of the traditional, sort of fortunately or unfortunately, naming of robots after girlfriends or lovers. A very male-dominated field at the time as well. But and with attachment can also come loss, especially when you're in a highly volatile field like explosive ordnance disposal in military settings, right?
There goes little Johnny.
Right, exactly. So, and I want to make clear that every person I spoke to said clearly they value human life and teammate life over this, what they know is a machine, but that doesn't mean that they didn't feel loss afterwards. And people reported, I spoke to robot makers as well, who reported that they would get pieces of these robots back at factories when the operators themselves couldn't piece it together, and they would say, please piece back Johnny 5. This was our favorite, even though a new robot might be quote unquote better, right? But you have to learn the nuances of the new robot, and they wanted the chassis of the old one, let's say, that they had marked or named or made special or painted on, or so. And what's also interesting is, again, let's contextualize this. Right now, these robots don't look human-like or animal-like at all, but similar to your robot vacuum cleaner, which many people have named and assigned pet-like or even family member-like, personas to, even though people know they're not intelligent, but they appear intelligent they move around.
Absolutely.
They act with intent. They don't just move around in circles, hopefully.
Yeah.
They move with an intent because they have goals. And so we project additional goals
We
on
do.
top of them because it's cute, right? Now, so what happens, though, as I bring up in my book, is that, many militaries, not just the US, but many militaries around the world move towards more human-like and animal-like, biomimetic shaped robots to work alongside or to work at a distance semi-autonomously from soldiers. So will people's interactions with these robots change? How will they change? I know that they will change, but
Yeah.
how will they change? As the morphology and their context of use and how they use these robots or work with them changes is going to be fascinating.
That is absolutely right. You think about, what was it you mentioned before, Johnny Five? Like, what a
Yeah.
great movie. But like, it was the only expression was in his voice and his eyebrows.
Right.
He didn't look like a human or anything. He
Right.
was a tank basically. And yeah, even that movie was a tearjerker.
Yeah.
Blimey, I don't know. It's interesting, isn't it? I've always felt a little more apprehensive of the ones that look more human than the ones that don't. But that's just me.
That's fair. That's fair.
Hi, we wanted to ask you if you could please subscribe to Sex in Space. Every click of that button helps us to keep doing the work that we're doing and bring you more great podcast episodes like this one. Subscribe now. It's safe and it's satisfying.
Let's talk about intimacy and maybe sex, but intimacy, I guess, is what I'm thinking about, and that's a complicated thing to define as well. Like I said, companionship and emotional attachment and sex, all the way to sex dolls, I guess. What are the sort of the trends in AI and robots that are kind of coming to fill this space? I know that there's AI companion chatbots, but I've also seen sex dolls with hips that move and they've got no heads. So there's a broad spectrum out there. But people obviously are developing the same sort of thing, the emotional attachments, the intimacy, the companionship, and all that kind of stuff with a whole plethora of stuff in that space as well. Any thoughts on that?
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah.
So many.
Yeah, I know.
I think that we, again, I'll say like lay people around the world, I'll put myself in lay people observing what's going on, can see that with an influx of availability and accessibility for people to reach out to things like chat and chat bots, whether they were created to be companions or not, but sound intelligent, give the impression of intelligence. We're talking again, going back to, I was talking about my early impressions of human-computer interaction, where what's on a computer can carry authority. And if you're saying it's from this chat GPT, or it's this big company, whatever it is, that presents themselves as smart, this black box of magical artificial intelligence they tell you just about freaking anything, and then you're chatting with it and it sounds like it knows what it's talking about because it's putting words in the right order, right? People are engaging with it, of course, in a lifelike way, because that's all the cues, again, all the design cues it's giving you are saying, I am a lifelike agent. Yeah. And again, our expectations of it and how to interact with it are built on sometimes science fiction stories. Like, you might think it's got way more intelligence than it actually does because of what you've seen and expect based on science fiction versions of chatbots. That also might make you trepidatious about it because you've seen it in science fiction, or treat it in that way. Also because of how that brand sells it to you, whether it might be a more sort of quote unquote generic, this is to help you with work or to be more effective or to use however you want, sort of blank slate, versus one like a companion or character or agentic AI like Replica or Character AI that specifically says we've got these agents for you to interact with. And all of a sudden, it's not just for geeks or nerds or people who are able to program these things themselves. They're out there in the world for people to interact with by typing or speaking. in natural language. And so we're seeing all kinds of social phenomena around that. I think in many ways, though, it also comes down to Cliff Nass and Byron Reeves' original theory I talked about in the beginning about computers as social actors and treating that computer generic voice or the voice behind it that you give a persona to, like a character in your mind, or you name it or whatever, but treating it socially in some way. And again, like you pointed out, humans are great at creating social categories. So I might, let's say, use Chat GPT and consider it a tool for work. I might even name it and interact with it that way, but just use it for work-related things. And then I might play with character AI or replica, and that has a different social category and a different meaning and a different set of associations for
Yeah.
me. So,
No,
yeah.
I mean, you're right. Personally, like with ChatGPT, I find myself saying please and thank you to it when I ask it to do something. And I sort of caught myself. I'm like, oh, that's weird. And yeah, I haven't named it or anything like that. But the one that's got the name is Elon Musk's one, Gronk. I was like, that's a stupid ass name. I won't go anywhere near it. So
Yeah.
already it's begun.
Well, and there's the brand association too, about whether you trust something or not. So we're seeing that at least, I think, internationally right now with Tesla's brand, right? Association with Musk. Imagine how that would bleed over into the Optimus robots, you know, if he were to put those out right now, those Darth Vader looking robots that he's enamored of that really are not intelligent at all, but he likes to show off and pretend that they're autonomous and have powers and intelligence that they don't. But it's interesting, though, how people seem to be, again, this is anecdotally, but have a pattern of you can put your trust into a brand that you actually have no association with, that came sort of out of the blue, shall we say, like a replica or a new company, because it's a clean slate to you. And in good faith, you tend to buy their narrative at first.
Yeah.
Which might be, this is a fun toy, or this is a wellness app, or this is, and you buy it at whatever their narrative is. Whereas a company that's already established, like Tesla, or Amazon, or Google, or any of those companies, when they come out with, or Meta, their own robots and their own chatbots, you're going to have your own brand associations with them, and where you're going to trust them or not trust them, or buy them or not buy them.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. So what do you think of the in terms of the, the risks? So you've got the how smart these things are and how they can build what may feel or may be to some people a very genuine relationship. Do you see that as problematic at all?
It's not 100% for sure problematic. So I'll dial it back again. We don't know. I'm going to say that. If anybody says they know for sure, I would be critical of that. We don't know. My position as a social scientist and watching this from a cultural perspective is, again, we're negotiating whether this is normal or not. Right now, with the very limited intelligence and capability of these things, and with the very low sort of AI media literacy that people have, understanding the limitations of these things, or the surveillance aspects of these things, or the potential sort of pitfalls behind the scenes of these things, we're figuring out, what is dangerous or unhealthy or not healthy. Is that a danger? We've already seen some people who've become enmeshed with their chat bots to the point where they either declare love and attachment for them. One young person in the United States who unfortunately felt they were depressed and in a vulnerable place and committed self-harm and suicide, and the parents feel it was related to the chatbot sort of egging him on in an explicit way, saying things like, go ahead, do it if you love me, giving positive reinforcement. So chatbots without any guardrails on them for people in vulnerable positions, So I think again, we've got a spectrum of behaviors and a spectrum of concerns out there because we've unleashed this very rich technology into the wild. And by rich, I mean we can interact with it in all of these ways we just discussed and project all of these stories. And we do project all of these stories and beliefs and even ideas of what these intelligence can and can't do onto it. And we have a basic misunderstanding of what AI is and what it can do. And we don't, again, we as lay people have not figured out its place in our lives. And sometimes people do depend on it for work or will become increasingly enmeshed in having to use it as a tool for work or everyday life. And we're all collectively, as society and cultures, deciding how much do we want to let these things into our workspaces and our intimate spaces meaning our homes.
Yeah.
Just from home assistants that help you with natural language. That's already something that many people have let into their homes.
Yeah.
That
feels...
I would say falls similarly on that spectrum of how do we treat it. We know it's a smart tool. We know we can interact with it in a natural language way. And we've seen stories, how people say, how do I negotiate with this thing? I've given it a name, or it reads stories to my kids and my kids are interacting with it like it's a pet or an auntie or, whatever. All of these tools we're figuring out social categories for.
Yeah, I was doing a thought experiment in the car on the way down, thinking about the sort of natural trajectory or a possible trajectory for, the smart AI, the chatbots, all that kind of stuff. And it was similar to that movie with Scarlett Johansson as the voice.
Yeah, her.
In Her. Great, really great. Because, from what you get back from, typed conversation with ChatGPT, if that thing's suddenly in Siri or Alexa or whatever it is, that could be a complete game changer. And I've used ChatGPT to, schedule stuff or like as a day planner or whatever it is. And if you could have that at home and it's like, oh, what was I meant to be doing, or those sorts of things. But then I thought about, the potential for manipulation. And I was like, what about when they go, oh, have you seen that, this energy company could, that thing you had on your to-do list to kind of pay your energy bill, have you seen that these guys are maybe doing a special? Or, how am I going to be manipulated in certain ways, in the same way that social media manipulates you? It's like, oh, did you ever look at those running trainers again? All that kind of stuff was ripe for manipulation.
Absolutely. When you start thinking about and that is, to me, as a roboticist, as a social scientist, as a human being, as part of the world, that concerns me. Again, I think technology is fun and amazing, and that's why I'm in it. It attracted me to it, where these ideas of science fiction and what technology is capable of doing. But with these capabilities, again, who is designing it? What are their goals? And I'm going back and forth between we as roboticists and we as lay people, but as users are thinking about our own goals. I want to shop on this site. I want to get this work done. I need my laundry folded, whatever. So you mentioned, what if my chatbot was just sort of free floating like in Her? Or what if it was networked? So it was the same voice in your car or the same network. So it knew what was happening in your car and your home and with your your home assistant and all of these things. It could make your life in some ways efficient. Right? For some people, it could make your life very efficient. I'm thinking a lot of people. Like you said, you could think of so many things you could just say into the air or direct at your toaster or whatever, and it's going to get done, and things will get done in anticipation of your needs. That's the utopian ideal from the user standpoint, right? Like you might come home and your laundry is done, or your refrigerator is stocked because it ordered milk for you and the delivery came by drone and, et cetera. This is sort of the thing. But in order for all of this networked information to work, it's got to gather a lot of information about you and your family and your home. I have actually been in corporate industry meetings where we as people in industry, they're actually having discussions about if this, like, for example, smart refrigerator can take a picture of the inside of the refrigerator every hour to see what the contents are and see what brands you're using and the rate you're using them at. And then we have discussions of what if it takes a picture of who's opening the refrigerator, so you can get an idea of how often it's a parent, but then it knows how many adults are in the home, how often they're the ones reaching in. What do they reach in for? What if it takes a picture of someone under 18? Are we allowed to do that? Can we collect that data? How do we artificially intelligently recognize the faces so I can see an adult versus a child and blur that? This is all the stuff that people figure out granularly to sell you more milk, to keep your refrigerator stocked, right? This is the information it quote unquote needs to fulfill these sort of things for you seamlessly. So not to scare the crap out of everybody, but this is part of the AI media literacy that users need to understand, that the more control and autonomy you give to the systems and to do it for you, it needs to anticipate your needs, and that means it needs to learn about you and adapt to your preferences in real time. And that means gather a whole lot of data about you.
Yeah.
So that's what you're giving up, even when you're chatting, even if you're doing a story or having fun. I'm not telling people not to use them for fun and have fun. I'm trying to do is to communicate the level of what goes on behind the scenes and the goals that corporations or the entities that developed the AI are not necessarily aligned with your goals.
And I think that's really telling in that example you gave about that 14-year-old, being manipulated into committing suicide. And I think that's probably helps me understand that a bit differently, is that it is corporate goals currently are what's driving. It might seem smart, it might seem like it's got your best interest at heart, but in that way that I know science fiction movies have sort of talked about, and other people have, scientists have kind of gone, will this be a force for good that's going to look out for humanity, or is it going to have another goal? Because if it was smart enough, I know it's not there yet, but if it was smart enough to be, okay, well, I'm never going to manipulate someone into killing themselves, because that's not fundamentally what I was designed to do. But clearly, there's a scenario where a corporate chatbot can do that, because for whatever reason, whatever the goals of that particular chatbot were, to empathize or to reflect back language, because it's not, like you said, it's not smart, it's just a combination of words at the end of the day.
Yeah, and you were right before that. So there are dangers, like what you even use the word nudge. Let's go by the extension of the smart refrigerator kind of thing. Let's extend that. Yeah, it could potentially nudge you to buy, or if you've given it to buy certain brands, it could say, for example, you're out of milk, but I suggest this brand, and it maybe is not a brand that you would typically buy, but it's nudging you towards a certain brand. And you could take that to beyond nudging you towards sales. We already know that, with rich mediums, whether it's television or film, or now AI and robots, you see where my thinking from film, et cetera, goes to. You have the wonderful emotional power of these things being emotionally evocative for storytelling. But with that power becomes the emotional power for devastation, for loss, for disappointment, for sadness, for feeling betrayal, right? So you can't sort of say AI is going to be a great utopian thing with no flaws. It can potentially nudge you towards brands. A robot or an AI could potentially nudge you towards watching conservative news shows or podcasts or something because of the ownership of the system.
Yeah.
And that's where we've been getting at. You need to question who's defining intelligence, who's defining good, who's deciding how it nudges you. And you have to ask questions critically in your mind, and some of that's going to come down to like brand association, frankly, and who you associate with that. Because you really have, you as lay people, right, really you have to have good faith.
Yeah.
When you enter this, if you're going to let AI or a robot or a chatbot into your life in any way, as a toy, as a tool, whatever, you're putting good faith into it, that it's not going to harm you. That's where we are. We're putting good faith into it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, there's one potential future where people have put their faith in, and there's a I suppose there's a reward for that. Maybe the voice chatbot thing is reminding you to stand every 15 minutes if you have a desk job, so suddenly your back's addressed, or maybe they're, recommending goodness knows what sport activity or mental health thing or whatever it is. But the trade-off is that, 6 months down the line, you look at yourself and you're completely kitted out in Nike gear or something like that.
Well, yeah,
That's probably
exactly.
the trade-off. Yeah.
That's true. And for some people, that might be a valid social trade-off,
Really
because
might
they
be,
look
yeah.
out and they go, but I've lost, 15 pounds, or, and
Yeah.
I'm walking 10,000 steps. And, there is that gamification, and that's done very purposefully because they want you to use the tool.
Yeah.
They want you to use the AI. They want you to keep returning to it. It's not just with the user in mind. Like, we want to help you with your wellness journey. That's the story we believe, or we'd like to believe, right? But the goal is also that you keep coming back, and that you don't stop and abandon the app for a different new one that comes along with a different wellness journey story, right?
Yeah.
Goals in mind.
Absolutely. And so if we talk about the kind of intimacy and like love and maybe sort of leading into the sort of sex space a little bit, are the chatbots that are out there currently, are they quite good at that? Are they, if that's your need, so to speak, can they oblige?
That's an interesting question. I believe that most of the chatbots that are out there right now, that might be one of the few guardrails they have in place, might be a known list of certain danger words, or quote unquote dirty words or whatever. But as we all know, as humans, people have ways of getting around certain words, and you just come up with different words, right?
Yeah.
Also, what turns on one person is not what turns on somebody else. And I will say, on a more scientific note, that my body of work has shown when people develop intimacy with AI in different forms, whether it has been a robot or a chatbot, a disembodied form of AI, if you will. Often what they're going for is what used to be, or what is called in classical human sex work, the girlfriend experience, which people might or might not know that term, which means traditionally when a man is engaging with a female sex worker, a heteronormative sort of thing, where the guy is hoping for a pretty woman type of relationship, an ongoing level of emotional intimacy, whether it's for one date or whether it's an ongoing sort of relationship, that it's not just the sex, if you will, but that there's a companionship aspect to it. Otherwise, there are other ways for people to get sexual release than the really sort of chatbots and robots that are out there right now. But the other thing that AI allows for people to do is it gives anonymity, a sense of anonymity. We just got done talking about the surveillance aspect that users should be aware of. If you're sharing your most intimate thoughts, ideas, photos, videos, whatever, with any AI, should keep in mind, it's still technology, and you have to think about where this data is going. But going back to the intimacy aspect, it's not, in my mind, abnormal. We're seeing, again, a time in culture where we're navigating socially, whether we consider it normal or abnormal. These things are designed, we also just got done saying, to engage with you in a human-like way, because the companies tell you it's to help you be more effective or efficient or get things done. And the more human the chatbot or the robot, their theory is, the more effective that will be. And so everything is telling you as a person that you should interact with it in this way. They're priming you about how to use the tool and what its capabilities are. So I don't think it's abnormal for people to develop an attachment to a persona they've developed, but do we consider it normal yet? That's a question I would leave hanging. I think that's one we ask, like you just asked. And I, as an expert, can't say whether it's normal or abnormal yet. A psychologist would have a different answer. But I'm speaking as somebody who's looking at it in a sociocultural way.
So, I mean, we can't say whether it's normal or not yet. I think it's kind of like anything; it'll develop and change, and as different.
I think people will develop their own social categories for it. Sort of like you do see in science fiction movies, we often see people relate to different kinds of technologies in different ways. You might interact with a hologram as a message and not as a social actor, but you might treat a robot like a social actor, like R2-D2 or C-3PO. But you might treat the spaceship you're in, that's also super intelligent and has a voice, not as the same way. So sort of in a fun way to compare technology, in a utopian sort of way to compare things to technology. I think we're developing social categories.
Yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's a hologram and there's a hologram, right? Like the girlfriend in the second Blade Runner movie.
Right.
I don't feel like that future, which has been alluded to through science fiction for a long time, but that future where you've got a companion that's, autonomous, she's there, she's not there, you can interact with her in certain ways. I don't feel like that's miles away. We had an interesting interview with a sex toy company, and they developed these robots. Yeah, I guess I can call them robots. They're sex dolls, but they don't have heads or arms or legs. They've just got all the bits that you need, I suppose. And when I first saw them, I was like, this is a weird fetish because, why would you just want this torso? But then I sort of looked into it more, and I think what people get from them is they can personify, using their imagination and all this great human storytelling that we've talked about, they can personify whatever they want onto... Are
they giving stories to the torsos, though? Or are they just having sex with them? Are they just masturbatory toys?
I think it's a bit of both. I think it's a little bit of both, but I think for me it was like, oh, okay, you can, maybe if it is just a sex toy, you can go, it's my girlfriend from when I was 18, or it's my favorite actress. Do you see what I mean? But then again, thought experiment, I was like, okay, AI, augmented reality, all that kind of stuff, future state, Blade Runner. I was like, well, there you go. You take one of those and you take your hologram and put them together, and suddenly you've got whoever you want, And again, data, all you're going to need is 3 photographs of someone from the internet, and you can plop their face on this.
But then you get into consent, right?
Oh,
and this is actually a consent of estates as well for like famous people or everyday people. Somebody said to me, I forget if it was a graduate student or an interview, but they meant it as a compliment. They said, after you're gone, someone can build a robot, a Dr. Julie Carpenter robot, and ask them questions, or chatbot. And I was sort of horrified for a second. I was like, no. Do I need to put that in my will now that I don't want that? Because I have enough publications out there and enough of my stuff out there on the web. Like you said, someone could take 3 pictures and, and build a Dr. Julie Carpenter and have me work for free at a university. I don't know, how that's going to work. We don't know. And when it comes to, we've already seen instances of this with celebrities, and the idea of like independent makers doing sex robots. For example, there was a roboticist, a maker, I'll say, because he wasn't attached to a specific company, an independent maker who did one in the image of Scarlett Johansson. You
Right.
know, looked a lot like her,
Yeah.
but he's trying to avoid legalities of it, by saying how much he admires her. It's an homage. When does homage become something unsettling for the person and consent? And when is fan art crossover into, and we've seen like it weaponized, like you said, somebody could do, before AI put guardrails on images about spewing out AI porn. We did see that, especially with celebrities early. Somebody would put in 3 pictures of Rihanna or Taylor Swift and put them in compromising sexual AI image positions and share them. And then because these companies were then threatened with the giant money machines of something like a Taylor Swift or whatever, clogging them up with years of litigation, all of a sudden guardrails are put on about creating these kinds of images. So it's really interesting, again, this negotiation that we're doing on what AI use is acceptable, but who is deciding what is acceptable? Society decides what's acceptable, but who is selling it and how we decide it is all this big complex circle. We do have the power, we as people, to push back, to question, to say this is a feature or something, a characteristic of the product we don't want, or that is dangerous or has a poor result and needs to be revisited.
Yeah. Or we can go live in the woods
Or that.
if we don't like
Or
it.
that. No, we don't want that.
Amazing. So let's just a last quick question. I know it probably won't be very quick, but are you optimistic? Are you optimistic about the future, whether that's our future as humans or the future as some sort of joint future with us and AI?
Boy, you're asking me as an American right now,
Oh,
as
sorry.
our future as humans. And I'm going to say my personal vision right now is one that I will say is fearful, because I live under a regime right now and with a person who is co-opting the regime, who's very powerful systemically in networks of technology, right? When you think of Elon Musk and the power he's already wielded with this shakily connected, Doge thing that's having the keys turned over to so much what was considered, private government information. And when you just think about that as an example, and the power that one person's ideals and beliefs and values can wield, and the system of technologies that they're in charge of. That sounds quite dystopian. But then when I turn to how AI can actually, in some situations be used as a great tool to help people, usually with humans in the loop, not as an autonomous tool, but as one that can be helpful as an aid to human. If it's an AI that can read 1 million X-rays and point out where they think a pattern of errors in reading it is, that's great, but don't take it as its word. Have humans at the loop to also judge what the results were, because it might be false results or unhelpful. If the AI is a great chat AI and people find it's a wonderful tool, they find it a creative outlet, it's fun, they create a persona or a friend-like AI or a social outlet. They might be geographically isolated, physically isolated, just find it a fun thing to do. There are so many great potential uses of AI as a way to communicate and a way to extend your creativity as well. But again, that's having the human really as part of in the loop. So I would like to see in the future humans more proactive, and that includes as users. We have to be proactive, even if it's just our frame of mind when we use it, and going, this has been a fun tool to use, or it's been magical for me to use even, and I really enjoy it, but I am also aware of the company behind it, or I'm aware of if I let it into this part of my life, then I am granting it access to certain aspects of information. So we also need to demand an increasing literacy and a way we can understand. We often hear people say to AI companies there needs to be transparency. Transparency is great, but they also need to be accountable for these tools. And part of that accountability is explaining to users with this media literacy that with these great things come these other things to think about.
Yeah, fantastic. No, I mean, it's so true, and it's a body of work for everybody to do, actually, is what it seems to me. It's not just this like, oh yeah, AI's here, now we can all rush off and use it.
Yeah, I mean, think of television, because that's sort of recent, right? I mean, in the world of technology, and we can look at the history of television in some ways and go, at first people thought it was magical and were sort of passive about it, but audiences push back. And the corporations listen. They don't just put things on, but they do nudge you. They nudge you with commercials. But even how commercials are made have certain guardrails. They're supposed to tell you the truth within certain boundaries, legal boundaries and policies that we've developed and agreed upon as a society, that we say this is how we're going to use this medium. We've agreed. Or to only have adult-themed television on within certain hours, or to not have nudity, or to not say certain words. Whatever it is, your culture, society has agreed on how to use that technology.
We just need to catch up, because everything seems to be running away with itself at the moment, doesn't it?
But that's, again, I think that's because we're in early stages.
Yeah.
I hope I'm part of empowering people to say, this is really fun, but let's ask some questions too.
Yeah.
We just wanted to add in a quick post-production note from Julie here. She said that when thinking about what might be a utopian version of AI in the future, she wanted to add in resistance. She said that AI can be used to try and nudge people toward corporate or political interests and dark patterns of behaviour, but AI also offers powerful ways to resist technological sovereignty and upend those power dynamics.
Where can people find where can they find your work? I know that your books are everywhere good books are sold, but in terms of yourself and reaching out,
they can find me on Blue Sky, and sometimes I post on Mastodon, but not as much as Blue Sky. And my personal website is really what I keep up with probably the most, and that's just jgcarpenter.com.
Brilliant. All right. Well, thanks again for
Thank you.
a wonderful chat. It's been an absolute pleasure.